right, welcome back to episode 16 of the Bible Connection podcast. Guys, this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you to not give up on reading your Bibles this year. So I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are some of my good friends, Brandon Stooksbury.
Hey.
Taylor Babcock.
Hey.
And John Steinke.
Hey.
So guys, we're going over 1 Kings. And just a little insight, the book of Kings was originally one text, but our Bibles have divided into two parts for the reader. So we got 1 Kings, 2 Kings. So hopping right in the first three chapters of 1 Kings, we see the transition from David to Solomon's kingship, where ultimately Solomon is given extraordinary wisdom from God. What is wisdom? And why is it such an important marker for Solomon's kingship?
So really quickly, before we get into that, we need to see how Kings starts, because you may be a little bit confused as to what's happening here. And Adonijah, who is we've seen him in 2 Samuel, but Adonijah, we see that the first few verses deal with David in his old age. He's given Abishag the Shunammite to keep him warm at night. It's kind of strange to us today, right? They didn't have central heat and air, whatever. But after this, we see that Adonijah, that he, in verse 5, now Adonijah the son of Haggith exalted himself, saying, I will be king, right? So after this, or in this same section in verse 9, look at what it says here. Adonijah sacrificed sheep, oxen, and fattened cattle by the serpent stone. So we see this battle from Genesis 3:15 of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman now is playing out yet again, right? Within David's own household, even of his own lineage, there's a serpent within the house, right? And this serpent, Adonijah, right? He is asking. He's going to Bathsheba and asking for Abishag the Shunammite, this woman who was laying with David. And what I think is happening here is this is connecting back to we saw how Absalom took David's harem of concubines and basically did what he did to show that he now was the king, right? And then afterwards, Adonijah did similar. He was trying to take the kingdom again, but here. We see this is what is happening. What he's trying to do, possibly Nathan? No, the second son.
Ammon?
No, that was the first
Absalom?
son. Absalom. Yeah.
There's a lot of sons of David. He had a lot of wives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, but. Getting into wisdom, Taylor, we were all talking about this before, but what you were saying was fantastic. So,
So Solomon is known for wisdom, and when you look all the way back to Genesis 2 and 3, you'll actually see them in the garden. God's presence is in the garden, and at the center of the garden is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they're not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So we see that phrase, a knowledge of good and evil, very early on in the scriptures. And then we actually see it again here in 1 Kings. In chapter 3, verse 9, Solomon, and without going too detailed in the story, because I'm sure John will probably explain it out, but it says that Solomon wanted to have the ability that he may discern between good and evil. And that phrase, good and evil, is synonymous with wisdom. It's a euphemism for wisdom, and wisdom, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom. So anytime that you come across a knowledge of good and evil in the scriptures, it means wisdom. And to have wisdom, or the beginning of the wisdom, is the fear of the Lord. Anything outside of that, it's not the equivalent of intelligence or an understanding of just something in general, but rather something we uniquely following under God's law. And we see that early on in Solomon's life, in which he had wisdom, in which he is trusting the Lord. Now, early on with Adam and Eve in the garden, you notice that they choose of the fruit themselves of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they weren't supposed to, lest they die. And they chose for themselves what they thought was best. But we see wisdom here as what Solomon's choosing. He's trusting in the Lord. He is doing the very thing that Adam and Eve failed to do, is trusting in the Lord here. So we see that wisdom is what Solomon has doing, and we see literature explaining that too.
And coming out of 2 Samuel, the expectation the readers would have in their day, and that we would have as we go through the Bible, is this covenant's just been made with David, and if you listen to the last episode of this podcast, we spoke in high platitudes about the significance of this covenant, and that the son is going to be on the throne forever, the house of David forever. And so Solomon here is now acting out as the fulfillment of that promise, and so will his son after him and his son after him. And 1 Kings is structured in such a way where this theme of wisdom is the yardstick by which all of these kings are measured. You see, in verse 3 of chapter 3, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And when the Lord comes to him in a dream, you should immediately be reminiscent of the other figures in the Bible. Every time the Lord speaks to someone through dreams in the Bible, you get these figures of these people that you know right and wrong, that they are wise. Think of Joseph, think of Daniel. And so the Lord comes into a dream and says, what would you want? And out of all things, he chooses, verse 9, give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. And so you're going to see that as the measuring stick where every king is measured, because 1 Kings and 2 Kings, they're unraveling this depiction of trying to get back in the garden. I know that's something we've been emphasizing for quite a while, right? But the man is not dwelling with God. How is man going to enter once again past the flaming swords of judgment from the cherubim? How are they going to enter again to dwell in the life-giving presence of God? And the beginning of that is to have a leader in Israel who knows right from wrong and who has that wisdom.
Yeah, and you see in Solomon's writings in the Proverbs later on, he in chapter 8, he what was the word you used earlier? How he is not embodying wisdom, but is personifying. That's the word I'm looking for. Solomon is personifying wisdom in chapter 8, and you see in Proverbs 8:15, he says, "By me," and he's speaking of wisdom there. "Kings reign, and rulers decree what is just. By me," wisdom again, "princes rule, and nobles, all who govern justly." Right. So, I love the imagery of Solomon being like another Adam who is in this, and we're going to see he finds himself in this garden imagery. You know, the temple being the imagery of the garden, and he is not taking of the fruit, but he is coming to this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he's asking of it, and the Lord is giving it. He's not taking it. The Lord is giving this wisdom to him.
And wisdom is going to be a theme that's explored throughout the Tanakh. If you remember, the beginning of this podcast, we said that the Tanakh, the Old Testament scriptures, are the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And if you just take all the vowels out and say it really quickly, it just sounds like Tanakh, right? That's where we get the name for the Hebrew Bible. Well, we've been reading the Nevi'im, the prophets section, but we'll soon be getting into the Psalms, and we're going to be talking about the wisdom literature, the Ketuvim, the writings. And throughout the Psalms, the book of Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and even Daniel, which are all considered not prophets but writings, wisdom literature, this word, Hakmah, is wisdom, is going to be thoroughly explored as the most recurring word in each of those texts.
So real quick, I just wanted to kind of reverberate here. You said, so basically the important, why is it such an important marker of Solomon's kingship? Is that because every king afterwards will be judged by that standard?
Every king afterward will be, throughout the book of Kings, are going to be measured against whether they did right in the eyes of the Lord,
right, okay,
or evil. And also the anticipation in the text is that this son from the lineage of David should be on the kingdom forever and ever, on the throne. And so there's this, when is there going to be the king that fully obeys
right,
and keeps the law of the Lord?
Right. Okay, cool. So moving on, in chapters 4 through 10, we see Solomon's kingdom flourish, and a temple is built for the Lord in Jerusalem. So a couple things. What is the significance of this temple? Also, what does it have to do with the tabernacle? And also, what can we gain from all the descriptions of the temple architecture and design?
This is a question that has captivated my focus on the Old Testament for about 7 years. So 7 years ago, Brandon, you and Allison went out of town. I don't know where to, but you left a sticky note on a book on your coffee table, and it was this big, thick book, and you wrote, "You have 4 days with nothing to do. Read this." And it was Kingdom Through Covenant.
Were you babies in the house or something?
Yeah, I was house sitting.
Oh,
I
there
just
you
need
go.
somebody to feed the dog and take out the trash, basically. I have no clue if I understood anything in that book when I first read it, but it sent me down a rabbit trail of, I think, my first taste of biblical theology. So biblical theology is this a way of approaching the scriptures that views the whole Bible as one united theology of Christ. Christ was a biblical theologian. On the road to Emmaus, I've referenced this before in the podcast, he told the disciples that beginning with the law and the prophets, everything concerned himself. And so when we get into this question of what can we learn from the architecture of the temple, it's not just a historical leftovers of an ancient book that doesn't apply to us and we need to get to the part where the people are making moral decisions. We have a lot we can learn from. No matter what our intellectual level or understanding, there's something you can glean from this. And so if you're confused as to how do you apply this to your life, I want to point out 4 things. Because it seems in chapter 6 and 7 that there's so many descriptions. What am I supposed to do with all this? I actually think you can simplify it into only 4 things I want you to see from this temple. First, it's a 3-space temple. It's tripartite. Taylor, can you tell us about that in a second?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Second, I want you to see garden imagery. You might think that I've been reading a little bit too much about garden imagery in this podcast, but if you read these chapters, you're going to see open pomegranates and gourds and palm trees and opening flowers and 400 pomegranates all intricately woven in. Then I also want you to see the gold, and I want you to see the cherubim. And those are basically the only 4 pictures you get from this. And what should that evoke in your mind? Well, where do you see a 3-space location that's filled with gold and flowers and garden imagery and cherubim? You see it all the time in the Torah. In the garden imagery, in the garden, it says the first description of the garden, a river flowed out of Eden into a land where there was good gold. And they were in the garden in the midst. So there's Eden, the garden in Eden, and then when they sin, they're removed out of that. The third look at a 3-space area. And what guards them from the east from entering in? Cherubim. And you see the same pattern picked up in the tabernacle with the same floral designs, making the lampstands and woven into the fabric and the cherubim. And it opens to the east in a 3-space. Everything's covered in gold. And now here in the temple. So this is a continuation to represent the dwelling place of God, the separation of his holiness from the sinful people removed from his presence. And so when Solomon is carefully articulating the way that this is being built, this temple is meant to show you, just like I said a second ago, the anticipation of the text is that Solomon is the son of David. Can he be the one who sits on the throne forever? Will he perfectly keep the law? There needs to be a reversal of that removal from the garden. And now, ever since the Day of Atonement in Leviticus, and I'm all over the place right now, but I'm so excited. Ever since the Day of Atonement in Leviticus, we know that the way to enter into God's presence is through atoning sacrifice. And the pattern of God's presence is that he's separated the veil from the people. His holy place is separated, and only those who stand as a figurative representative, a priest to intercede from the people, can enter in. All of that will ultimately be fulfilled in Christ. He will be the atoning sacrifice. He will be the intercessor who enters into the holy place of God. He will deliver the blood on the cross that, unlike the blood of bulls and goats, can forever take away sins. And at the moment of his death, the curtain itself is ripped in two, and the people in the sinful places in the outer courts are now able to enter in freely into the divine presence of God. So I love temples. That's what I got to say.
Yeah, and
Do you think that the ark was a temple? because it was tripartite. It was closed. It was closed
The
by
law
God.
was inside. I've read a lot about that, and again, no matter what your learning level, you got something you can learn. I don't know if I necessarily see that.
Gordon Wenham does.
There's a lot you can look into with all that. And Taylor, what about tripartite temples?
Tripartite temples are. First of all, that was beautifully said. That was, yes, all of that is so fascinating. All of this is for the purpose of showing God's presence.
Mm-hmm.
God's presence is foremost. Every time you read the word temple or tabernacle or even back to the garden, it's about God's presence. So every bit of that is painting a picture that was familiar to the Israelites, that they understood. Their concepts of how things worked was communicated through what John just explained out, which is a tripartite temple. And that tripartite temple has an outer court, an inner court, and a holy of holies. And specifically within the holy of holies was God's presence. So all of that, the imagery that you see from the garden, is a depiction of a recreation of where Adam and Eve were in the garden, in God's presence, where God was walking in the cool of the day. So we see every bit of that as a way to redeem mankind, or a communication about God's promise to redeem mankind through all of this temple imagery. So if you look, and John touched on some of this, but I do want to add a few things here within the temple, and then within the garden. Adam is placed in the garden to work and keep it. That's from the Hebrew words abad and samar. The priest in the temple were to abad and samar. They were to work and keep it. So really what you see by Adam and Eve being in the garden is not to be farmers, but rather to be upholding the requirements of being image bearers of God.
Servant kings and priests to God.
Exactly. And that's that's the imagery that is portrayed in the temple too. So God's presence, you see the priestly responsibilities. The tree of life is, if you look at the description of the lampstand back in Exodus, and there should be 6 branches going out of its sides, 3 branches of the lampstand out of one side of it, and 3 branches on the lampstand out of the other side of it. More imagery that depicts that of a garden. They are once again in the temple or the tabernacle, because Exodus was the tabernacle, that shows that this is a recreation of that garden space where God's presence was. So John mentioned this, that the temple had carvings reflecting the garden. In 1 Kings 6, the cedar within the house was carved in the form of gourds and open flowers. All with cedar, no stone was seen. The inner sanctuary he prepared in the innermost part of the house to set there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. The Ark of the Covenant is significant in that, God's presence is shown by it. The Ark of the Covenant and the Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil are both pictures of wisdom, actually. Touch either of them and you die. Adam and Eve touched of the Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil, they died. Touch the Ark, if you 2 Samuel chapter 6, Uzzah touches the Ark and he dies. You touch that and you die. So there's a picture there. Once again, it's God's presence. We are a people sinful that cannot touch God's presence.
So something I want to emphasize that you're saying, and I love that you're saying it's a picture, right? We're not mystics, We're not people who that think that there's this relic out there that's been lost in Indiana Jones style. If you look at it, it's going to melt your eyeballs, right? If you look at Solomon, he wasn't a mystic either. He wasn't some superstitious, dumb Iron Age guy that thought God literally dwelled in a box, right? If you look at chapter 8, verse 27, Solomon says, "But will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven can't even contain you. How much less than a house that I have built?" So yes, the Lord has a special presence with his people in Jerusalem. I affirm that. But we also know it is a symbolic. God's not contained by boxes and temples, but the Lord has a special relationship with his people that he's revealing through these images. And that's why I think that we have the not just the freedom and the license, but we're encouraged by the text to recognize the symbolic connection to the garden and to the tabernacle and to ultimately the dwelling of God in Revelation when we see that there's no more temples needed, because this dwelling place of God and this presence is a picture that's meant to help us see, not confusing imagery that's meant to burden us. This is meant to help you see what it looks like to be right in the presence of God.
Yeah, and sorry, something from years and years and years ago that I've always remembered because it's short and punchy and it speaks a lot of truth. David Jeremiah, I heard him say this, I don't know, 10 years ago or more, but he said the symbol of God's presence is never the prison of his essence. So I think that and I think he was talking about this passage right here.
Yeah, absolutely. Symbolism. So one thing that we often lose sight of is we're Westerners. They were Easterners conceptually, and the way that we understand things are very different. There's a lot of imagery. There are concrete examples as you read through the Psalms that God communicates in imagery that God is our shepherd. The Lord is our shepherd. He is our rock. He's our fortress. The temple is one more physical representation of that, a way to symbolize and show where God is. And I think that is understood by the Israelites, and often God communicates to the Israelites in such a way that they understood it according to their culture, their customs, the way of life that they had. And we see that not just in the temple, but really in many, many examples from Genesis all the way up through on out the story of the Israelites, of concrete examples of God showing his way of redemption.
So just a quick visual to establish for y'all. In the description below, we plan to leave a link to a video that I watched in studying this week that gives you a great visualization of this temple. And I encourage you to pray about and think about what these images are for us as you watch that and as you're thinking about this text.
And we're dealing quickly with the dedication of the temple in chapter 8. I want to point us to a couple things. One, Solomon definitely, like you said, Taylor, was an Easterner, and this is kind of funny, but it's interesting. But in verse 22 of chapter 8, it said, "Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands towards heaven." Right? We think about how we, if you're really worshiping, you put your hands in the air, right? But if you're praying, your hands are down and your eyes are closed. It's like, that's literally the opposite of what Solomon's doing. I'm not saying that's the way we need to do it now, but it's interesting. But
I'm saying you have the freedom to do that now.
Exactly. But what I wanted to show us from this section is I've been speaking of chesed and emet, right? God's his covenant keeping, right, and his love. That's literally what is said here. And I read verse 22, but in verse 23, and he said, "O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant, chesed, and showing steadfast love to your servants, emet." That's the word behind there, and this is rich. It's over and over and over played out, right? And we're going to see Paul picks up on this in Ephesians 4 later, in months from now. But there are 7 things that Solomon prays in the dedication of the temple. And we don't have time to look at all of them. I would encourage you to look at that. But I want us to see something very, very important, because what was the temple's role? Like why was the temple there? Right? There were many reasons why it was there, but we don't need to think that this was just something for Israel, right? Because what you need to see is in verse 41. Solomon says, "Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays towards this house here in heaven, your dwelling place, and do according to all which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, and as your people of Israel, that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name." So we see here the the temple in Israel is not just for the people of Israel. We see that there's an eschatological. He's even saying that even when people who are not in Jerusalem, when they pray towards Jerusalem, hear what they're saying, right? Because they're looking to you. And that's what, as the scriptures are going to unfold and unfold and unfold, we've already seen that there have been Gentiles grafted in. We've seen Rahab, we've seen Ruth, and we're going to continue to see this. But the people of Israel will become ingrown, and they will begin to think that these people, yes, they're to keep their distance as far as Israel is never to, even when they go into exile. They are leaving Israel, right? But they are never to adopt Israel. Should never become like the nations, right? The nations should look to Israel and to Israel's covenant-keeping God.
Mm-hmm.
So,
all right, moving on. Chapters 11 through 15, we see Solomon turn from the Lord and the division of the kingdom of Israel under the rule of his son. So, what happened to cause this division, and when will it be united again?
Well, Brandon was just saying that this temple was supposed to be an image for the foreigners in the land, that they may see the dwelling place of the Lord and know what right worship with the Lord is. And what do we see Solomon doing in chapter 11? Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David had done. He built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. And so he did this because of his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. So now when the foreigners enter the land, what are they going to see? They're going to see them look just like the other nations, rather than this kingdom of priests. And the Lord raises up adversaries for Solomon. And honestly, this section of the text is not the most confusing to read through. It, again, reads like a drama. You can kind of see what's going on here. But one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is just how bad it gets before the kingdom splits. So because of this sin, the Lord raises up a prophet named Ahijah. And this prophet named Ahijah goes before Jeroboam, and he's walking on the road, and he takes his new coat off, and he starts ripping it into pieces, to 12 pieces. And he hands 10 pieces to Jeroboam, and 2 he keeps for himself. And he prophesies and says, this is what the Lord is going to do to the kingdom. He's not going to take away the house of Judah from Solomon because of his love for David, but he's going to hand over the kingdom to Israel. And when you read through chapter 15, that's exactly what happens. Rehoboam makes a foolish decision not to trust the advisors of Solomon. I always pause for a second when I say that phrase. The advisors of the wisest man who ever lived. Think of the arrogance to ignore those guys, right? So he ignores the wisdom of his father's advisors. He fiercely disciplines the people. Jeroboam goes on to become king who is going to raise up golden calves, saying the same sinful thing that was said in at Mount Sinai, behold your gods who raised you up out of the land of Egypt. And so the reason for this division, the reason for all of the pain and suffering is ultimately because they've turned their back on the Lord. And the Lord has been emphasizing repeatedly that if they do not keep right worship, then he will not let them dwell in the land forever.
All right, moving on. So if the beginning of 1 Kings centered around King Solomon in the temple, then the end of 1 Kings, specifically 16 through 21, it centers around King Ahab and the prophet Elijah. So what was Elijah sent to accomplish in Israel, and what can we learn from his life story? And also, remind me to ask my question about Elijah. Okay, can you guys do that for me? Cool.
I'll try.
I'll forget. So, if you remember back, before we got into 1st and 2nd Samuel, all the way back in Judges, there were these 2 character gods named Baal and Asherah, and they're still there by the time we get to Kings. And Baal, if you remember, is the god of weather and storms, and Asherah is the goddess of fertility. So we see that the Israelites are struggling with worshiping these false pagan gods and Yahweh at the same time. There's actually archaeological evidence that's been found of inscriptions saying Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. There's actually a lot of this back in that time period. And we also also, as we read in the scriptures, that the Israelites are worshiping both Yahweh and other gods. So as we get into the story with Elijah and the false prophets, there is a question of who is their God. And what was the question again, Josh?
I got you. So what was or what was Elijah sent to accomplish in Israel, and what can we learn from his life story? And we're talking about, King Ahab, basically.
Yeah, so King Ahab, he actually is married to a Phoenician Baal priestess named Jezebel. And Ahab was wicked. Jezebel was wicked. And there's all of this sacrifices and pagan sacrifices to Baal and Asherah on these high places. Actually, it mentions that Dan and Beersheba that is going on in Israel. And whenever you see from Dan to Beersheba, that just means all of Israel. That covers all across the land. So we see that there's worship of these other gods, and Elijah is to confront these false gods and to ask the question, if they're God, let them do what they can do. If God is God, let him demonstrate his power. And we see that Elijah is confronting them in chapter 18. And if I want to fast forward to chapter 18, or actually chapter 17, we see that there is a drought, that actually Elijah prays for a drought. And the reason that he prays for a drought is that Baal is the god of weather and storms. And the people of Israel are dependent upon this weather for their agriculture, for their economy. And essentially, by having a drought, it removed any way for them to recognize Baal as their leader and God and providing for their means of life. So Elijah is actually praying for a drought. And if you know anything about the Jezreel Valley, which is just south of where Mount Carmel is and where this interaction goes on in chapter 18, is the breadbasket of Israel, where all of their crops and where all of their food really predominantly come from. And so there's a drought. Elijah prays for this drought that they may recognize that this false god Baal is not the one who is actually providing for them.
And so I think Brandon wants to talk about the showdown between Elijah and these prophets of Baal, but you might be confused. Ahab, I thought we were talking about Solomon. Where'd Ahab come from? And so the kingdom split, and there's all of these kings in North Israel and in South Israel because of that, promise from the Lord that was given to Jeroboam that 10 of the tribes would be given to him and the other 2 would remain in Judah. And so my recommendation, it's going to be a little difficult to memorize all of these names. Get a good chart. Look for a chart that can separate the lineage of the kings of Judah in the south and the kings of Israel in the north, and try to look at it as you go through your Bible to keep it straight. I know Scott Hood, he'd be happy to provide you with some pictures and charts. He's got some great, he just got licensing for some of that. He could print it off for you if that would be helpful. If you'd like to stop us in church and see if we could help you find something. So like in Judah, you had Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, and his son was Abijam, and his son was Asa, and his son was Jehoshaphat. And they were the 4 kings of Judah throughout 1 Kings. And that's not really centered on at all when we get to Ahab. Ahab comes from the horrendous line that comes back from Jeroboam, where there's coups and murders and supplanted thrones, and it's just crazy. And every king before them, remember we said structurally, they're judged by whether they did right or evil, not Lord. Everyone before them did more evil than any of them that were before. So that by the time you get to Ahab, he's the most wicked man that has lived in Israel.
Yeah, and if you have a question on the chronology of the kings in this, John would never say this, but go to him. He knows this better than anybody that I know of. That being said, this is Dr. Prost has talked about this in this past Sundays. When this is recorded, it'll be a few weeks ago. But this is the great showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And we see before this that God's election, right? Elijah thinks that he's the only one, and the Lord tells him, no, there's 7,000. Like, I'm keeping for myself 7,000. And the basis of election is plays into this. But in chapter 18, we see here that as Taylor was saying, the people of Israel are depending on Baal, and Elijah is saying, no, you either let's throw down here. It's either going to be Baal or Yahweh, right? And
oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you with that. I don't know what I was thinking. I just pointed at a scripture verse to Brandon. Sorry.
But we see here the importance of satire, right? And we think, sometimes we may think that, mocking is wrong and we should never do it. Well, that's not exactly true. Jesus did it. Isaiah did it. Was this the question?
That was my question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna talk about it right now. If that's okay. Yeah. But it's not exactly wrong. And I think Elijah is justified here. I think Isaiah is justified here, and obviously I think Jesus is justified, if we can say that.
I'm glad you think that.
Yeah. Because Elijah in verse 27, it says at noon, and there's a lot we could talk about before this, and what exactly all went down to this, and the symbolism of pouring the water and whatnot. But in verse 27, it says, and at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep, and he must be awakened. And they cried out and cut themselves, as it was their custom, with swords and lances, and blood gushed out upon them. So Elijah is basically saying, he's either, he's pacified with his video games, or he's maybe he's stuck in the porta potty and he hasn't eaten nearly enough fiber, right? Or maybe he's on a journey, right? And you just he doesn't
through Patagonia.
He doesn't have long distance on his cell phone plan, right? But cry, but what?
Yes, Brett.
Yeah, cry a little louder, yell a little louder. So you see.
Maybe he'll hear your blood splashing on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. But you see here that Elijah is mocking something worthy of being mocked. The Baal worship of Baal is foolishness. It's stupidity. It needs to be mocked. And Isaiah does the same thing. He's confronting Israel again. Israel falls back into idolatry. And Isaiah says, okay, you have these carved gods. Which end of the log do you carve your God out of, and which end of the log do you cut your firewood out of? Because they both come from the same tree. Which end of the tree is more holy, right? Obviously, we should read that and laugh. It's funny, right? Jesus is talking to the, giving the parable, or telling the people, why is it that you point out a speck, right, in your brother's eye, when you have a freaking log in your own eye? Like, you're the imagery. I mean, just think about this. It's funny. You have you're, and I'm getting this from Mark Driscoll. I know his name's kind of mud right now, but it was epic what he said. But he's basically saying, you've got a freaking 16-foot 2x4 in your own eye, smacking somebody. As you turn, you hit somebody in the face with this 2x4 sticking out of your eye, and you're telling this person that you've just hit with this 2x4, hey man, you've got some sawdust in your eye and it's really embarrassing. Why don't you get that out of there? Because you're embarrassing me. And he's saying, no, you're an idiot. Get the 2x4, get the log out of your own eye before you criticize the speck in your brother's eye. And so we see here the importance of satire. And I would plug the Babylon Bee, because they're crushing all of the nonsense in our day. The Babylon Bee is using biblical, or is being satirical and mocking what is worthy of being mocked, right? All of just the endless amounts of nonsense that we see in our day. It's worthy of being mocked, and we as Christians should not shy away. We don't need to be jerks about it, right? And we don't need to be, hateful, right? But we should mock what's worthy of being mocked. So.
And speaking of irony, though, like, the Lord is no stranger to using it either. And so we come across at the end of 2 Samuel a really difficult passage when it comes to how the Lord interacts with the decisions of man and sin. And you come across in 1 Kings 22, one of the more difficult passages in the entire Bible. Again, not difficult because it's not clear, but because it's difficult because of the clarity with which we get some statements that make us uncomfortable. And looking at chapter 22, you see that Ahab, who has previously, been called the most sinful man, did more evil, even though it was a light thing to do, than any other man who lived before in Israel, that the Lord has anger built up against him, but because he repented, he's yet to judge him. And getting into chapter 22, this Ahab wants to go to war and have victory when he should be, think David, like a little bit more humble after making his mistakes. And so all of the prophets of God are telling Ahab, you're going to have victory. And Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, who's going to go to battle with him, is like, well, are you sure? Like, are there any other prophets? And Micaiah comes up, and he's like, well, I don't like this Micaiah guy. He only ever tells me things I don't like to hear. And he's like, well, ask him. And eventually it comes out from Micaiah that the reason why all of the prophets of God were telling him to go to war was because in the heavenly throne room, in the hidden places where we don't understand what's going on in heaven, the Lord had called to the spirits before him and said, who is going to go out there? Right? Let me read it. I don't want to say this incorrectly. Therefore here, verse 19, the word of the Lord, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing beside him on the right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he may go up and fall? It's pretty strong language. And what is said? One said one thing, one said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, said, I will entice him. The Lord said, by what means? He's not going to be ignorant, like willfully, of what's going to happen here. And he says, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all of his prophets. And then he said, you are to entice him, you shall succeed, go out and do so. And so the Lord here is once again demonstrating that he is actively in control and permissive that evil occurs so that his judgment can come on the land without being guilty of that sin or being the evildoer himself.
And you see similar to this, but not as strong of language. But what was in the kingdom being divided back in chapter 12, after Rehoboam makes the foolish decision to choose what he chose, in chapter 12 verse 15 it says, so the king did not listen to the people. Okay, it could have stopped there, but the author didn't chose to keep going. He said, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by Yahweh, that he might fulfill his word which he spoke by Abijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. It was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord. So that language is pervasive.
I want to back up just for 1 minute, back to Elijah. In that epic battle that Brandon just read. How will you go on limping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. In questioning that, Elijah, within like the Jewish culture, the Hebrew population, he was known as having passion more than anybody else of the Old Testament. And Elijah was that figure that people looked to, that the passion of Elijah, it was strong-willed and was just so passionate about doing things. After the confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah ran from, before Ahab, Mount Carmel to Jezreel. If you Google map that's 28 and a half miles to Jezreel. So after...
Of hilly cross-country terrain.
Yes, in shoes that are not probably as good as our tennis shoes today.
Jerusalem cruisers.
So in his Jerusalem cruisers, he ran 28 and a half miles. That's insane. And that's the kind of figure that he was. But just after that, in facing 450 false prophets of Baal, he gets scared and he goes and he runs from Jezebel. So I think once again, there are these pictures of people that we read about that are bigger than life sometimes, and they have this great faith, but then they have their flaws, and they're no different than us.
If you want to look at how human it is, what does the Lord tell him when he starts getting all sad? Take a nap, eat a snack. Like that's literally the prescription he gives to calm him down.
Like he's a child. It's just like, it's time for a nap. Let's get a snack. That's hilarious. All right. So I got one last thing, and then we're going to call it quits. And, well, I guess you kind of touched on this, didn't you,
Yeah, we
John?
already answered it.
Oh, good
Sorry,
deal.
I got ahead of myself.
Never mind. Okay. Well, that's it for episode 16. I just want to say thank you guys for joining along with us as we put this podcast out. And one of the things I want to encourage you guys is to help us make this podcast better and just serving you more. Please reach out to us with your questions. There's a couple ways you can do that. Either one, you can just leave a comment here on YouTube, or two, we have an email. It's the Bible Connection BDBC@gmail.com. Yep. And also, if you see us in church, just feel free to reach out. And like you said, like Brandon was saying, we can help you out with resources or just questions. It don't matter. But that's it for episode 16, and we'll see you on episode 17.